Tindra hadn't planned on being the most pitied woman at the Moon Festival. But here she was, standing at the edge of the lantern field with empty hands and no one beside her, while 1,000 strangers danced and laughed and celebrated around her like she didn't exist. The silk lantern swayed above her head in ribbons of pale gold and silver, casting shifting light across the crowd. The scent of moonbloom wine and roasted honeyed figs drifted through the warm evening air. Somewhere behind her, a fiddle picked up a melody that made couples press closer together. And Tindra stood perfectly still, her fingers curled into the fabric of her plain gray dress, and tried to remember how to breathe without her chest caving in. Her stepmother's words still clung to her skin like something rotten. "Stay here. Don't follow us. And for the love of the gods, don't speak to anyone. You'll only embarrass yourself." Viola had said it calmly, the way she said everything, with a smile so thin it could cut glass. Then she had taken Brielle's arm, her real daughter, her golden-haired, silk-wrapped, perfectly acceptable daughter, and vanished into the festival crowd without looking back. That had been over an hour ago. Tindra had stood in the same spot since, rooted by something heavier than obedience. Shame, maybe. Or the quiet, grinding certainty that Viola was right. She didn't belong here among the high families and their eligible daughters, the young wolves dressed in moonstone silks hoping to catch the eye of someone powerful. Tindra was none of those things. She was the late Chandler's daughter in a borrowed dress that didn't quite fit, with calloused hands that smelled permanently of tallow and lavender wax, and a wolf so faint inside her that most people assumed she didn't have one at all. Nobody was going to notice her tonight. Nobody ever did. So when the crowd began to shift, she didn't think anything of it at first. A murmur rippled through the bodies nearest to the central platform, a current of whispered names and sharp inhalations, and people moved. They didn't just step aside, they parted, pressing back against each other like the sea drawing away from shore. Tindra looked up, and the world stopped. He was crossing the lantern field. Not strolling, not wandering, not greeting anyone who reached for him. He was walking with the focused, deliberate stride of a man who could see exactly where he was going, and the crowd was melting out of his path like snow before a furnace. Alpha King Soren Velrath. She had never seen him in person. Every wolf in the kingdom of Valdrin knew his name, knew his face from the portrait coins minted after the Ashenmoor War, knew the legends that had already begun to calcify around him like barnacles on a warship. He had ended the border conflict in 7 weeks. He had killed the rogue Alpha Kessler in single combat, ending the uprising that had torn the eastern borderlands apart. He was the youngest king to take the Obsidian throne in 200 years, and he ruled with a cold, precise efficiency that made powerful men nervous. The portraits had not prepared her. He was taller than she had imagined, broader, darker. His black, formal coat hung open over a shirt that had been white once, but now looked faintly wrinkled, as though he had been gripping the collar. His jaw was set so tight she could see the muscle working beneath the skin. And his eyes, pale gray, almost silver in the lantern light, were locked onto her with an intensity that made her knees dissolve. He was walking toward her, directly toward her, not toward anyone near her, not past her, not through her, toward her. Tindra's heart began to pound so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. She glanced behind her. Nothing. No one. Just empty space and the trailing edge of the crowd. She looked back at him. He was 10 feet away now. 8. 5. Close enough that she could see what the lantern light had hidden at a distance. The bruised hollows beneath his eyes, the deep lines carved around his mouth that had no business being on a face that young. He looked like a man who hadn't rested in a very long time, and something beneath the exhaustion burned with a desperate, barely contained intensity that made the air between them feel like it was vibrating. He stopped in front of her. The noise of the festival seemed to fall away, muffled and distant, like someone had pressed cloth over the world. "Give me your hand," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected. Rougher, almost raw, like the words had been dragged out of somewhere deep. Tindra stared at him. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. His hand extended between them, palm up, steadied despite everything she could see coiling behind his eyes. He wasn't asking permission, but he was waiting for her to choose. She placed her hand in his. The moment their skin touched, something happened. She felt it. A shudder that passed through his entire body, visible and involuntary, like a man stepping out of a blizzard into warmth. His fingers closed around hers, and his eyes fell shut. The rigid line of his shoulders dropped, the muscles in his jaw unclenched, and the sound he made, quiet, broken, barely a breath, was the sound of someone experiencing relief so profound it bordered on agony. When he opened his eyes, they were wet. The entire lantern field had gone silent. 1,000 wolves stood frozen, watching their king hold the hand of a woman no one recognized. Tindra could feel every stare like a physical weight pressing against her skin. And across the crowd, framed by silver lanterns, Vila's face had gone the color of ash. 3 hours earlier, the evening had started the way every evening in Vila's household started, with Tindra being told exactly how little she mattered. "You're not wearing that," Vela said from the doorway. Tindra looked down at the blue dress she had pulled from the back of her wardrobe. It had been her mother's, the only thing of hers that Tindra still owned, and the fabric was still beautiful even after all these years. A deep twilight blue with tiny silver threads woven through the bodice like captured starlight. "It's the moon festival," Tindra said carefully. You thought you'd parade around in something that draws attention?" Vila stepped inside the room and the space immediately felt smaller. She was a tall woman, sharp-boned and elegant, with the kind of beauty that came with a constant, low-grade cruelty behind the eyes. "Take it off. Wear the gray one." Tindra's fingers tightened on the blue fabric. "The gray one has a stain on the sleeve." "Then keep your arms down." Brielle appeared behind her mother, already dressed in ivory silk that caught the lamplight like liquid pearl. Her golden hair was pinned with moonstone clips, and she looked exactly like what she was, a minor noble's daughter presented for display. "Mother, we're going to be late," Brielle said, her gaze sliding over Tindra with the practiced disinterest of someone examining furniture. "Does she really have to come?" "She's carrying the offering baskets," Vila replied. "Someone has to." Tindra changed into the gray dress. She carried the baskets to the carriage, loaded them into the back, and climbed in last. Vela spent the ride coaching Brielle on which families to approach and which to avoid. She did not speak to Tindra once. The Moon Festival was Valdrin's oldest tradition, held every autumn on the first full moon after the harvest. The entire capital of Thornhaven turned out. Lanterns were strung between every post and tree, thousands of them, filling the great meadow outside the palace walls with trembling golden light. Music drifted from 3 different stages. The air was thick with the smell of spiced cider and roasting chestnuts, and the sharp, clean bite of autumn frost. It was beautiful, and Tindra let herself feel it for exactly 30 seconds before Vela's voice cut through. "Set the baskets by the offering stones, then wait by the east gate." "The east gate?" Tindra repeated. The east gate was at the far edge of the grounds, away from the music, the food stalls, the dancing, away from everything. Vila didn't even look at her. "You heard me." Brielle was already walking toward the crowd. Vila followed. Neither looked back. Tindra carried the baskets to the offering stones, arranged them carefully the way her father had taught her years ago, and then stood there with her hands empty and nowhere to go. She didn't go to the east gate. Some stubborn, aching part of her refused. Instead, she walked toward the lantern field, the great open meadow at the heart of the festival, where unmated wolves gathered and the moonlight fell unbroken. She stood at its edge and watched people who belonged there laugh and reach for each other and dance. Her wolf stirred faintly in her chest, restless and thin, like a candle flame in a draught. It had always been weak. Vela had made sure Tindra knew this was a deficiency, a flaw, proof that she was less than what a proper wolf should be. Most days, Tindra believed her. The trumpets sounded without warning. A ripple of energy surged through the crowd. Every head turned toward the palace road where a procession of mounted guards was approaching, torchlight blazing against the dark. "The king," someone whispered. "The king is here." The crowd shifted into formation with practiced reverence, opening a wide corridor from the road to the central platform. And through it walked Alpha King Soren Velrath, flanked by his beta, a broad-shouldered man with watchful dark eyes, and a retinue of palace guards. But something was wrong. Tindra could see it even from the edge of the crowd. The king's stride was rigid, mechanical, like a man forcing his body through motions it no longer wanted to perform. His jaw was locked, and his hands were clenched into fists so tight his knuckles had gone bloodless. He looked like he was in pain, the kind that lived behind the eyes where no one could reach it. The beta leaned close and murmured something. Soren shook his head once, a sharp, dismissive jerk, and kept walking. He reached the central platform and turned to address the crowd. The speech was brief, formal. Tindra barely heard the words. She was watching his face, the way his eyes kept unfocusing for half a second before snapping back, the way his fingers pressed against his temple when he thought no one was looking. Then he left the platform. He was supposed to stay for the traditional first dance. He didn't. He stepped down and walked into the crowd, and his beta followed with an expression caught between concern and alarm. The crowd absorbed him. Tindra lost sight of him for a moment. Then the parting began. That slow, inexorable opening of bodies as something moved through them with unstoppable momentum. And he emerged from the press of people, walking directly toward her. She felt it before she understood it. A hush falling over her own mind, like the moment before snow, a strange settling quiet that had nothing to do with the noise around her, and everything to do with the man approaching. He stopped in front of her. His eyes found hers, and everything that followed, the hand, the touch, the shudder, the relief in his face that was almost too raw to witness, happened in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "Give me your hand," he said, and she did. The silence that fell over the lantern field lasted only seconds, but it felt like years. Then the king's beta was at his side, his voice urgent and low enough that only Tindra could hear. "Sire, what's happening? Are you well?" Soren's eyes were still closed, his fingers still wrapped around Tindra's. When he spoke, his voice was different, lighter, like a weight had been physically removed from his chest. "For the first time in over a year," he said, "I am." The beta's gaze snapped to Tindra. She watched his expression cycle through confusion, suspicion, and something dangerously close to hope, all in the span of a breath. "She comes with us," Soren said, opening his eyes. Tindra's stomach dropped. "What?" "Sire," the beta started. "Tonight, Calder." The king's voice left no room for argument. "She comes tonight." Movement at the edge of the crowd. Vila was pushing forward, Brielle in tow, her face a rigid mask of controlled fury. "Your Majesty," she said, her curtsy so deep it was almost mocking. "I see you've met my stepdaughter. I must apologize if she's troubled you in any way. She's a bit simple, I'm afraid, and—" "Your name," Soren said. He wasn't looking at Vila. He was looking at Tindra, and the intensity in his gaze made her mouth go dry. "Tindra," she managed. "Tindra Ashvain." Something flickered behind his eyes. "Tindra." The way he said her name made it sound like a word he'd been searching for. Viola opened her mouth to say something else, but Soren turned his head slowly and looked at her. Just looked. The expression on his face was perfectly neutral, perfectly still, and absolutely terrifying. Viola's mouth closed. Her face went white. "She comes with me," Soren repeated quietly. Then he turned and walked toward the palace road, Tindra's hand still locked in his. She stumbled after him, her heart hammering, the lantern field falling away behind her. The last thing she saw before the crowd swallowed the view was Viola's face, bloodless and rigid, and Brielle beside her, staring at Tindra with an expression she had never seen her stepsister wear before. Fear. The palace swallowed her whole. Tindra was led through corridors of dark stone and flickering torchlight, past tapestries taller than houses, and doors reinforced with iron the width of her fist. Guards stood at every junction, their faces blank, their eyes tracking her with quiet assessment. The king walked ahead of her, his stride long and relentless, and she had to half run to keep pace. He still hadn't let go of her hand. "Your Majesty," Tindra tried, breathless. "I don't understand what's happening." No answer. His grip tightened fractionally, almost reflexive, like a man clutching a rope over a chasm. Calder walked beside her, his expression carefully neutral. "You'll be given a room," he said, "and an explanation. In that order. But my stepmother has been informed." The beta's tone suggested that the informing had not been gentle. They stopped before a heavy oak door at the end of a lamplit corridor. Calder pushed it open, revealing a modest but clean chamber with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the palace's inner courtyard. A fire had been laid but not lit. A single candle burned on the bedside table. The king released her hand. The effect was immediate. Tindra watched it happen in real time, the tension flooding back into his shoulders, the clench returning to his jaw, his fingers pressing hard against his temple as though trying to hold something inside his skull. He took a sharp breath through his teeth, and for a single, unguarded moment, his face twisted with something that looked like agony. Then it was gone, controlled, locked away behind the mask he wore like armor. "Stay here tonight," he said without turning around. "Calder will come for you in the morning." He left. The door closed behind him, and Tindra stood alone in a stranger's room inside the Alpha King's palace, wearing a stained gray dress and carrying absolutely nothing. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her shaking hands flat against her knees. Her mind raced through the events of the last hour, trying to assemble them into something that made sense. The king of Valdrin had crossed an entire festival, in front of 1,000 witnesses, to hold the hand of a nobody candlemaker's daughter. He had trembled when he touched her. He had nearly wept. And when he let go, the pain had come back so fast it was as though her touch had been the only thing keeping it at bay. That wasn't normal. Kings didn't do that. Powerful alphas didn't cross crowded fields to clutch the hand of a stranger and look at her like she was oxygen, unless something was very, very wrong with him. Sleep didn't come. Tindra lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the stone ceiling, listening to the palace settle around her. Distant footsteps, the low murmur of guards changing shifts, the wind pressing against the window glass, and then, so faint she almost missed it, a sound, not from the corridor, not from outside, from somewhere deeper, carried through the stone walls like a vibration more than a noise. A voice. No, voices. Layered and indistinct, like dozens of people whispering at once, their words tumbling over each other until meaning dissolved into a single oppressive drone. Tindra sat up slowly, her skin prickling. She held her breath and listened. The whispers ebbed and surged, rising in pitch before falling again, rhythmic, almost tidal. They seemed to be coming from somewhere above her, somewhere in the direction of the king's chambers. She pressed her hand against the wall. The stone was cold beneath her palm, and for a moment, just a flicker, she could have sworn she felt the vibration of those whispers pass through her fingers like a pulse. Then silence. Absolute and sudden, as though someone had pressed a hand over a screaming mouth. Tindra pulled her hand back and stared at the wall. Her heart was beating very fast. She did not sleep for a long time. Morning arrived gray and thin. A knock at the door brought a servant with a tray of bread, cold meat, and tea that was still hot. Tindra ate mechanically, tasting nothing. Calder arrived an hour later. His expression was the same controlled neutrality as the night before, but there was something new in his eyes, a careful, measuring quality, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle, and she was the only remaining piece. "Miss Ashvane," he said, "the king requests your presence." Tindra followed him through the palace corridors, her stomach in knots. The hallways were busier now, servants and officials moving with the brisk efficiency of a court in motion. Several of them looked at her. Some openly stared. "Has anyone told you why you're here?" Calder asked, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "No," Tindra said. "No one has told me anything." Calder was quiet for a moment. "The king suffers from a condition," he said carefully. "One that the court healers have been unable to treat. We believe your presence may have a beneficial effect." He paused. "We'd like to test that theory." "A beneficial effect?" Tindra repeated. "What kind of condition?" But Calder had stopped before another heavy door, and the conversation was over. The king's private study was smaller than she had expected, lined with bookshelves and stacked with documents. A fire burned in the grate, and behind a wide desk, his head bent over a map marked with colored pins, sat Soren Velrath. He looked worse in daylight. The hollows beneath his eyes were deeper, almost bruised. His skin had a grayish cast that spoke of prolonged exhaustion, and the tension in his body was constant, a low-frequency vibration like a bowstring drawn too tight for too long. He didn't look up when she entered. He was pressing 2 fingers against his left temple, and his breathing was shallow and controlled in the way of someone managing pain. "Sit," Calder murmured, gesturing to a chair against the wall, maybe 10 feet from the king's desk. Tindra sat. She folded her hands in her lap and tried to be invisible. 5 minutes passed. The king continued working, his pen moving across the map's margin in tight, precise notations. His jaw was still clenched, and she could see the white pressure of his fingertips against his temple. Then, gradually, something shifted. It was subtle at first, the pen slowing, the tension in his shoulders loosening by fractions. His fingers dropped away from his temple. His breathing deepened. The rigid set of his spine eased until he was sitting naturally for the first time since she had entered the room. He looked up. His eyes found hers across the study, and the expression in them made her breath catch. It was the same look from the festival, that raw, unguarded relief, stripped of all pretense. "You can hear them, can't you?" Tindra said quietly. The words came out before she could stop them. She didn't know where they had come from, only that they were true, as certain and instinctive as breathing. Soren stared at her. The silence stretched between them, taut and fragile. "Voices," Tindra continued, her own voice barely above a whisper. "Whispering. All the time. They don't stop." Something in his composure fractured, not visibly, not in any way that someone across a courtyard would notice. But Tindra was close enough to see the crack spread through him, the way his throat worked around a swallow, the way his hands went very still on the desk. "How could you possibly know that?" he asked. Tindra's mouth was dry. "Because last night," she said, "I heard them too." Calder, who had been standing silently by the door, went rigid. The king rose slowly from his chair, and the full height of him was enough to make the room feel smaller. "That's not possible," Soren said. But his voice wasn't angry, It was afraid. And behind the fear, buried so deep she almost missed it, was something else entirely. Hope. Days passed, and a rhythm formed around them like water finding the shape of a riverbed. Each morning, Calder escorted Tindra from her small chamber to the king's study. Each morning, she sat in the chair against the wall while Soren worked at his desk, and the voices that clawed at the inside of his skull retreated into something bearable. Each evening, she was escorted back, and the distance between them filled with all the things neither of them said. The first few days were painfully silent. Tindra sat rigid in her chair, hands folded, barely breathing, terrified of drawing attention to herself. Soren worked without acknowledging her presence, his pen scratching across parchment, his jaw tight, his focus absolute and deliberate in the way of a man refusing to let himself look at something. But silence, when shared long enough, becomes its own kind of intimacy. On the third day, a thicker blanket appeared, folded over the arm of her chair. It hadn't been there the morning before. Tindra looked at it, then looked at the king. He didn't look up. She wrapped it around her shoulders and said nothing. On the fifth day, she noticed he had stopped taking his tea. The cup sat untouched on the corner of his desk, growing cold. The next morning, she asked the servant who brought the tray to include honey. When Soren finally reached for the cup out of habit and tasted it, he paused. His gaze flicked to her for half a second. She pretended to be fascinated by the ceiling. The following morning, the honey was already on the tray. On the seventh day, he spoke first. "What did you do?" he asked, his eyes still on the document in front of him. "Before this?" The question was so unexpected that Tindra startled. "Before being kidnapped by the crown?" she asked. Something twitched at the corner of his mouth. "Recruited. I made candles," she said. "My father was a chandler. He had a shop in the lower quarter before he married Vila. After he died, she kept the business. I do most of the work." She paused. "Did most of the work." "Festival candles?" he asked. "All kinds. But yes, the Moon Festival commissions were the largest orders. 300 lantern candles this year. All hand-dipped." She looked down at her hands, at the faint waxy sheen that never fully left her fingertips. "My father used to say that making candles was the closest an ordinary person could get to holding light in their hands." Soren was quiet for a long moment. When she glanced up, he was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Not the desperate intensity from the festival night, or the guarded blankness of their early days. Something softer, something almost curious. "He sounds like a good man," Soren said. "He was," Tindra replied, and her voice cracked just slightly on the second word. She cleared her throat. "Until he wasn't." The silence that followed felt different from the ones before. Weighted, but not heavy. Like he understood exactly what she meant without needing her to explain. The space between them shrank by an inch that neither of them measured. The changes accelerated after that. He started asking her questions, small ones that disguised themselves as idle curiosity. What herbs she mixed into the wax for scent, whether she preferred winter or summer, had she ever traveled beyond Thornhaven. She answered honestly, and sometimes she asked questions back. "Do you always work this late?" she asked one evening when the fire had burned to embers and the candles were guttering in their holders. "There is always more to do," he replied without looking up. "That's not what I asked." He set down his pen then, and when he met her gaze, something unguarded flickered behind his eyes. "If I stop," he said quietly, "the noise gets louder." Tindra's chest ached. She held his gaze and nodded slowly. "Then I'll stay while you work." One afternoon, the voices must have receded far enough because his head dipped forward over a supply report. His pen went slack in his fingers, and his breathing deepened into the slow, unmistakable rhythm of sleep. It lasted maybe 15 minutes. But when he woke with a sharp intake of breath and looked immediately to the chair where she sat, Tindra saw something cross his face that made her heart do something strange and reckless. Relief that she was still there. That evening, Marin, the palace healer, intercepted Tindra in the corridor outside her room. Marin was a compact woman with steady hands and the kind of eyes that had seen too much to be shocked by anything. She had been tending to the king since the curse began, and the weight of that failure sat visibly across her shoulders. "Walk with me," Marin said. It wasn't a request. They walked the torchlit corridor slowly. Marin spoke in measured, careful sentences, each word placed like a stone in a wall. "The king's condition has been worsening for 14 months. The voices are the dead of Ashenmoor. Hundreds of them. They whisper constantly, day and night. He hasn't had a full night's rest since the curse was laid." Tindra swallowed hard. "I know he hears things. I can see it in his face. What you've done in a week. No healer, no herb, no remedy has managed in over a year. When you're near him, the voices diminish. When you touch him..." Marin paused, choosing her next words with visible care. "When you touch him, they go silent completely." The implication settled over Tindra like a cold wave. "You need to be closer to him," Marin said. "Proximity helps. Contact would be better." Tindra opened her mouth, but nothing came out. That night, alone in her chamber, she lay in the dark and tried to quiet her racing mind. Sleep hovered at the edges but wouldn't come. An hour passed, then another. Then she heard them. The whispers. Faint, indistinct, rising through the stones beneath her like heat from a buried fire. She had heard them once before, on her first night in the palace, distant and strange. But tonight they were closer. Tonight they had texture, shape, and somewhere in the tangled chorus, threading through the noise like a silver wire through dark cloth, one voice separated from the rest. It was saying her name. Tindra arrived at the king's study the next morning before Calder came to collect her. She hadn't slept. The voice whispering her name had circled through her mind all night, soft and patient and impossible to ignore, and by dawn she had given up trying. The guards at the study door exchanged glances but let her pass. Soren was already inside, standing at the window with his back to the room. His hands were braced against the stone sill, his fingers white with pressure. His breathing was wrong, shallow and ragged, with pauses that lasted too long, as though each breath required a conscious decision. "Your Majesty?" Tindra said from the doorway. He didn't turn. Not now. She should have listened. She should have sat in her chair and waited and done what she had been brought here to do, which was exist quietly in his proximity. But something in the sound of his breathing pulled at her like a fishhook behind her ribs, and she crossed the room without deciding to. "Soren," she said. The sound of his own name, spoken without title or formality, made him flinch. He turned his head slightly, and she saw his face in profile. His skin had gone the color of wet ash. Sweat stood on his temple. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at something she couldn't see, and the muscles in his jaw were jumping erratically as though he were clenching his teeth against a scream. The voices were bad today. She could feel it without hearing them, a pressure in the air around him, dense and trembling, like the atmosphere before a storm. Tindra reached out and placed her hand on his forearm. The world disappeared. One moment she was standing in the fire-lit study with her fingers on the king's sleeve. The next she was standing on a battlefield. The sky was the color of a bruise, heavy and low, pressing down on a landscape so devastated it barely registered as real. The ground beneath her feet was scorched earth mixed with ash, barren and lifeless. Broken weapons jutted from the earth like rotten teeth. The air tasted of iron and smoke, and grief so concentrated it had become a physical thing, thick enough to chew. And the dead were everywhere. They stood in clusters across the ruined field, hundreds of them, wolves in human form with hollow eyes that held nothing but accusation. Some of them were soldiers. Others wore the rough homespun of villagers, farmers, and innocents who had been in the wrong valley on the wrong day. A woman stood with empty arms crossed against her chest, her face carved with a grief too deep for words. Soren stood among them. Not the king she had come to know over the past week, guarded and exhausted and quietly kind. This was a hollowed version of him, stripped of everything except guilt. He stood with his arms at his sides, his head bowed, and the dead circled him like wolves around wounded prey. Their whispers were deafening up close. A wall of sound, hundreds of voices layered into a single crushing accusation that pressed against Tindra's skull until her vision blurred. You led us here. You ordered the advance. My children were in the village. You could have stopped this. Tindra gasped, staggering under the weight of it. But through the noise, one voice cut through with crystalline clarity. A woman stepped forward from the edge of the dead. She was different from the others, more solid, more present, with silver hair that moved in a wind that touched nothing else. Her eyes were black from corner to corner, deep and lightless, and they were fixed directly on Tindra, the witch. "Oh," the woman said, and her voice was soft, almost amused. "He found an anchor. How predictable." She tilted her head, studying Tindra with the detached curiosity of someone examining an insect. "Do you know what you are, girl? You're a bandage on a wound that needs cauterizing. You're temporary. You're borrowed time." "Who are you?" Tindra demanded, though her voice shook. "I am Nyx. I am the mother who buried her son Kessler because of his war." The witch's black eyes narrowed. "And I am the reason he will never know peace. Not while a single one of my dead still has a voice to speak with." Nyx leaned closer, and the temperature dropped until Tindra could see her own breath. "But you," the witch whispered, "you are interesting. I wonder, little anchor, how much of his suffering can you absorb before it eats you alive?" Something cold and sharp pierced Tindra's chest. She screamed, and she was back. The study floor was hard beneath her knees. She was on the ground, gasping, her hand still clutching Soren's arm. He was kneeling beside her, his hands gripping her shoulders, his face wild with panic. "Tindra, Tindra, look at me." She looked at him. His eyes were wide, terrified, searching her face with frantic intensity. "I saw them," she whispered. "The battlefield, the dead. I saw her. Nyx." The color drained from his face so completely he looked like a ghost himself. "No," he said. "She spoke to me. She called me an anchor. She said, 'No.'" He released her shoulders and stood, backing away. "That's not possible. You should not be able to—" The door burst open. Calder and Maren rushed in, alerted by the scream. Maren was at Tindra's side in seconds, checking her pulse, pressing cool fingers to her forehead. "What happened?" Calder demanded. "She went in," Soren said, his voice hollow. "She touched me, and the curse pulled her into the Ashenmoor vision. She saw the dead. She spoke with Nyx." Maren's hands went still on Tindra's wrist. She looked up at the king, and for the first time since Tindra had known her, the healer's composure cracked. "That changes things," Maren said quietly. "I need to examine her properly. Now." The examination took an hour. Maren worked in silence, methodical and thorough, running her fingers along the pressure points that shifter healers use to read the body's energy. When she was finished, she sat back and clasped her hands tightly in front of her, the way people do when they are about to deliver news they wish they didn't have. "The curse is transferring," Maren said. "The longer she spends near him, the more it latches onto her. It's subtle still, faint, but it's there. Proximity is giving the curse a bridge." Tindra felt the blood leave her face. Calder stepped forward. "Can it be reversed?" If exposure stops now, yes, probably. But if it continues. Marin didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. A sound from the doorway. Soren stood in the frame, motionless, and the expression on his face was something Tindra would remember for the rest of her life. It was the look of a man who had just been handed a knife and told to cut away the only thing keeping him alive. "Get her out," he said to Calder. His voice was flat, dead, emptied of everything. "Get her away from me, now." Tindra's heart shattered. "Soren, wait." He wouldn't look at her. His gaze stayed fixed on Calder with terrible, deliberate control. "Pack her things. Have a carriage readied within the hour. She goes back to wherever she came from, and she does not return." "You can't just—" "It's an order," the king said. And for the first time his voice broke on the last word. "Please." That single word, that fractured, desperate please, was worse than any command he could have given. Because it meant he wasn't doing this out of cruelty or indifference. He was doing it because he believed, with absolute certainty, that letting her stay would destroy her. Tindra was still reaching for him when Calder gently took her arm and led her away. The carriage ride back to Vila's house took 20 minutes. It felt like a funeral. Tindra sat with her hands folded in her lap, a borrowed cloak around her shoulders, staring at nothing while the palace grew smaller through the rear window. She wasn't crying. The tears wouldn't come. There was just a vast, hollow emptiness in her chest, like something essential had been removed, and the space it left behind hadn't figured out how to hurt yet. But it would. She could feel it building. Vila opened the front door before the carriage had fully stopped. Her expression cycled through surprise, suspicion, and vindictive satisfaction in rapid succession. "Well," Vila said, leaning against the doorframe, "that didn't last long, did it?" Tindra walked past her without a word and went to her room. Except it wasn't her room anymore. In the 10 days she had been gone, Vila had moved her belongings to the workshop, the cold, narrow space at the back of the house where the candle vats steamed, and the air was permanently thick with the smell of melted tallow. A thin mattress had been laid on the floor between the dipping racks. "Your old room is Brielle's fitting room now," Vila said from behind her, arms crossed, her smile a precision instrument. "Since you're clearly not important enough to warrant palace accommodations, I didn't think you'd mind the adjustment." Tindra set down her small bag and said nothing. "The whole city is talking about you," Vela continued. "Do you know how humiliating this has been for me, for Brielle, and now you come crawling back discarded. You've made us a laughingstock." "I'm sorry," Tindra said, "because it was easier than fighting. You should be. Double orders start tomorrow. I expect every candle dipped and trimmed before the month is out." The door closed. Tindra sat on the thin mattress, wrapped her arms around her knees, and waited for the tears. They didn't come that night either. What came instead was worse. The emptiness in her chest solidified into something with weight and texture. A dense, pulling ache that radiated outward from her sternum with every heartbeat. By the third day, the headache started. A slow, grinding pressure behind her eyes that peaked at night, leaving her curled on the workshop mattress with her hands pressed against her temples. And the whispers came back. Faint at first, easy to dismiss as imagination, but each night they grew louder, more distinct. She caught fragments now, broken syllables and half-formed accusations that slid through her mind like smoke under a door. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat without nausea rising. Her hands shook when she held the dipping frames. Twice she burned herself on hot wax and barely felt it. On the fourth day, Brielle found her leaning against the workshop wall, her eyes closed, her face damp with sweat. "You look terrible," Brielle said. There was no cruelty in it, only genuine, slightly alarmed observation. It was the kindest thing her stepsister had ever said to her. "I'm fine," Tindra managed. Brielle studied her for a moment, then left without pressing further. That night, Tindra found a cup of broth left outside the workshop door. She drank it and tried not to think about what it meant. By the 6th day, her wolf had become uncontrollable. The creature that had been silent and dormant her entire life was now pacing beneath her skin, frantic, desperate, straining toward the palace with every breath. The dissonance between her wolf's need and her body's stillness was tearing her apart from the inside. She heard rumors from the market vendors. The king had not been seen in public for 5 days. Guards had been doubled around his chambers. One vendor whispered that a servant had heard screaming from behind the king's door, and not the screaming of a man in anger, the screaming of a man in agony. On the 7th day, she went to the palace. She walked 3 miles on shaking legs, through the market district and up the winding road to the gates. She had nothing except the crushing certainty that if she didn't see him, something inside her was going to break beyond repair. Calder was at the gate. He looked almost as bad as she did, gray-faced and hollow-eyed. "The king's orders, Miss Ashvane," he said. "No entry." "Is he alive?" Tindra whispered. Calder's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. "Calder," Tindra said, and her voice broke. "Is he alive?" "Go home," Calder said. But his eyes were wet. That night, she collapsed in the workshop. One moment she was standing at the dipping rack. The next, the world tilted violently sideways and the floor rushed up to meet her. The candle frame clattered across the stone. Hot wax splattered against her arm, but she was already gone. She woke on the workshop floor to Marin's face above hers. The healer's hands were cool against her forehead, her expression tight with controlled urgency. "How long has she been like this?" Marin asked. Vila's voice came from near the door, thin and defensive. "How should I know?" Brielle's voice, quieter. 2 days. Maybe longer. I sent for you as soon as she fell." Marin helped Tindra sit up slowly. "The bond is forming whether you're near him or not," Marin said, her voice pitched for Tindra's ears alone. "The separation isn't stopping it. It's just making both of you suffer." "Bond?" Tindra whispered. "You're mating. Your wolves have recognized each other. It began the moment he touched you at the festival, maybe before, and the curse knows it." Marin's eyes were fierce. "The curse is using the bond as a channel. Every day you're apart, it digs deeper into both of you. He's not protecting you by sending you away. He's killing you both." Tindra closed her eyes. The words settled into her chest alongside the ache, and together they formed something that felt less like despair and more like certainty. "I have to go back," she said. "He won't allow it," Marin replied. "Then he'll have to drag me out himself." A sharp knock at the workshop door cut through the room like a blade. Vila opened it to reveal a palace messenger, young and breathless, his uniform streaked with rain. "I need Tindra Ashvane," the boy said, his voice cracking. "The king has collapsed. He's not responding to anyone. The healers can't reach him." The boy swallowed hard, his eyes wide and frightened. "He keeps saying a name, over and over. Just one name." The workshop went silent. Marin looked at Tindra. Tindra was already standing. The ride to the palace took less than 10 minutes. Marin had commandeered Vela's carriage without asking, and the horses ran hard through rain-slicked streets while Tindra gripped the seat and tried to breathe past the fist clenched around her heart. The gates were open when they arrived. No guards stopped them. The palace was in barely contained chaos, servants moving in tight clusters, voices low and urgent, every face wearing the same expression: dread. Calder met them at the base of the king's tower. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His uniform was creased, his jaw shadowed with stubble, and his eyes, when they found Tindra's, held a desperate, burning relief. "He's in his chambers," Calder said. "He stopped responding 2 hours ago. The healers can't get near him. His wolf is—" He stopped, shook his head. "Just hurry." Tindra ran. The king's chambers were dark. Every curtain drawn, every candle extinguished. The air was thick and wrong, heavy with a sharp, acrid edge that carried the weight of suffering. She found him on the floor beside the bed. He was curled in on himself, his hands pressed against his ears, his body shaking with tremors so violent she could hear his teeth chattering. His shirt was soaked through with sweat, and the sounds coming from his throat were barely human. Low, broken, involuntary noises torn from a man being consumed from the inside. "Soren," Tindra whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. His eyes were open but unseeing, rolled back until only the whites showed. His lips were moving, forming words she couldn't hear. An endless, silent conversation with the hundreds of voices screaming inside his skull. Tindra took his face in both hands. The effect was instantaneous. His body jerked once, hard, like a man shocked back to life. The trembling stopped. His eyes rolled forward, focused, found hers. And the sound he made, her name, broken and raw and desperate, was the most devastating thing she had ever heard. "You can't be here," he said. His hands came up to grip her wrists, and she couldn't tell if he was trying to pull her closer or push her away. "The curse. It's already killing us both," Tindra said. "Marin told me. The bond is forming whether we're together or apart, and the distance is making it worse, not better. You're not protecting me by pushing me away. You're just making sure we both die alone." His face crumbled. The composure, the control, the iron discipline that held him together through every sleepless night, all of it collapsed at once, and what was left was just a man. Exhausted, afraid, and desperately in love with someone he believed he was going to destroy. "I hear them every second," he whispered. "Every voice, every accusation. The only silence I've known in 14 months is you, and now the curse is reaching for you through me, and I can't—" His voice fractured. "I can't be the reason something happens to you." Tindra leaned forward until her forehead rested against his. She could feel the bond between them, that invisible thread pulled taut and vibrating with strain, and she could feel exactly how close it was to snapping. "Then stop fighting this alone," she said. "Let me in. All the way. Let me help you carry it." "You don't know what you're asking?" "I'm not asking." She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. "I'm telling you. I'm staying. And if you try to send me away again, I'll walk right back through those gates every single time until you understand that you do not get to decide for me what I can survive." Something gave way behind his eyes. Not the careful, controlled cracking she had seen in his study weeks ago, but a complete, devastating surrender. He pulled her against him and buried his face in her neck, and his entire body shook with the force of everything he had been holding back. Tindra wrapped her arms around him and held on. When he kissed her, it was the kiss of a man who had finally stopped trying to push away the only hand reaching for him. His fingers tangled in her hair, and his mouth found hers with a desperate, aching hunger that she answered with everything she had. The bond ignited. She felt it like a flame catching along a fuse, racing through her chest, her veins, her bones, until every part of her was lit from within. His teeth found the curve of her neck, and the bite was instinct, primal, a claim written in the oldest language wolves knew. Pain flared, then dissolved into something luminous and vast. Tindra bit him back, and the bond sealed itself between them with a sound she felt rather than heard, a deep, resonant hum that settled into her marrow like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting centuries to be opened. They held each other on the floor of his dark chamber, the bond pulsing warmly between them like a second heartbeat. His arms were wrapped around her so tightly she could feel the desperate strength in them, the refusal to let go again. "Stay," he said against her hair, not a command, a plea. "Always," she whispered. That night they slept in his bed, her back against his chest, his arm locked around her waist, And the silence was so deep and so complete that for the first time in 14 months, the only sound in the king's chambers was breathing. Tindra didn't know how long she slept before the dream took her. But when she opened her eyes, the warmth was gone. Cold air pressed against her skin. Ash filled her lungs, and the ruined battlefield of Ashenmoor stretched out before her in every direction, lit by a sky the color of an old wound. Soren stood beside her, his hand still holding hers, and at the center of the field, surrounded by the silent, watching dead, Nyx was waiting. "I was wondering," the witch said softly, "when you'd come back together." The dead pressed closer the moment Nyx spoke. They moved without walking, the space between them and Soren simply collapsing, and their whispers rose in unison until the sound was physical, a wall of noise closing in from every direction. Soren's grip on Tindra's hand tightened. She could feel his pulse hammering through his fingers, feel his body already bracing for what came next. Nyx watched them with those lightless black eyes, her silver hair drifting in a wind that existed only for her. She looked different this time, less solid, thinner at the edges, as though the curse that sustained her was a candle burning lower than before. "Every night for 14 months, Nyx said, he comes here, and every night he agrees. Do you understand that, little anchor? He doesn't fight me. He accepts the punishment because he believes he earned it." Tindra looked at Soren. His head was bowed. His shoulders curved inward as the whispers pressed against him, and she could feel through the bond exactly what Nyx described. Not resistance, but surrender. A door left unlocked because the prisoner believed the cell was where he belonged. "Is that true?" Tindra asked him quietly. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The bond answered for him, a flood of guilt so concentrated it nearly buckled her knees. The dead of Ashenmoor weren't just haunting him. They were the evidence in a trial he had been conducting against himself every single night. And every night he delivered the same verdict. Guilty. A soldier bearing the marks of battle stepped forward. "You gave the order to advance. You knew the village hadn't been evacuated." "The scouts reported it was clear," Soren whispered. "I made the decision based on—" "Children died," another voice cut in. "3 families who didn't make it out." Soren flinched. His hand slipped from Tindra's. He took a step toward the dead, then another, drawn by the gravity of his own guilt, and the gap between them widened. "Soren," Tindra called. He didn't turn. Nyx smiled, tired and brittle. "See? He always comes back to them." Tindra stared at the witch, at the brittle satisfaction in her face, and saw something she hadn't expected. Nyx wasn't gloating. She was grieving. Beneath the curse and the cruelty, there was a mother who had buried her son, and this endless torment was the only thing keeping her grief from becoming purposeless. Nyx wasn't just punishing Soren. She was keeping her own loss alive. Tindra walked toward Soren. The dead parted around her reluctantly, their whispers rising to a shriek. Every step felt like wading through deep water. But she kept walking until she was standing directly in front of him, close enough to see the tears tracking down his face. "Look at me," Tindra said. He shook his head. "You shouldn't have to see this." "Look at me," she repeated, and her voice cracked, and she didn't care. He looked. His gray eyes were shattered, stripped of every defense. Tindra took his hands. The dead screamed louder. She ignored them. "When my father married Vela," she said, "I was 7 years old, and within a year I stopped existing to him. Not because he was cruel. He just stopped seeing me. He chose her, and by choosing her, he unchose me. And I spent every day after that believing it was my fault." Her voice shook, but she held his gaze. "I believed I was unlovable, that there was something fundamentally wrong with me that made people leave. I wore that belief like a second skin for 15 years, Soren. I built my entire life around being small enough, quiet enough, useful enough that maybe someone would let me stay. The whispers faltered, like a choir losing its conductor. And I was wrong, Tindra said, tears spilling down her cheeks. It was never about me. My father's weakness was his own. Vila's cruelty was her own. I carried their failures inside my chest like they were mine, and it nearly killed me. She squeezed his hands. You made decisions in a war you didn't start. People died because war is a machine that eats everyone it touches, not because you weren't good enough to stop it. You have carried their deaths like a debt you owe, and you have been paying it every single night in this place, and it will never be enough because guilt doesn't have a finish line, Soren. It will take and take until there's nothing left of you. The dead had gone quiet, as though they were listening. Tindra turned to face them. Hundreds of hollow eyes stared back at her. She spoke to them directly, her voice raw but steady. You deserve to live. Every single one of you. And your grief is real. But keeping him here, feeding on his guilt, it won't undo what happened. All it does is add one more person to the list of casualties. She looked at the soldier bearing his scars, at the woman with her empty arms. Let him go, Tindra said softly. Not because he's earned it, not because the debt is paid, but because staying here is destroying him, and his destruction won't give any of you peace. Silence fell over the battlefield. True silence, the first this place had ever known. Tindra turned to Nyx. The witch's form was trembling now, flickering like a candle flame in a draught. And you, Tindra said gently. Your son died. That is a grief no mother should carry. But this curse isn't honoring him. It's just keeping you trapped here alongside the man you wanted to punish. Nyx's face contorted. You don't know what it is to lose a child. No, Tindra admitted. But I know what it is to hold on to pain so long it becomes the only thing holding you together. And I know that's not living. Something shifted in Nyx's expression. The rage cracked, and beneath it, ancient and exhausted, was sorrow so vast it filled the entire battlefield. I just wanted someone to pay, Nyx whispered. I know, Tindra said, but no one can pay enough. That's the truth that breaks us and the truth that sets us free. Soren's fingers tightened around hers. She felt it through the bond, the moment his grip on the guilt loosened. Not released, not forgotten, but set down. The way you set down something impossibly heavy that you've carried so long your arms have forgotten how to hang empty. I'm sorry, Soren said, and this time the words were directed inward. An apology to himself for the punishment he'd believed he deserved. The dead began to dissolve. One by one, face by face, they softened at the edges and faded like morning fog retreating from sunlight. Nyx was the last to go. She stood alone on the empty field, and for a single moment, the mask of the witch fell away entirely, and there was only a grieving mother looking at a grieving king. Take care of your people, she said quietly. Better than either of us managed. She closed her eyes. The silver light at her edges brightened once, then went out, and she was gone. The battlefield dissolved into warmth and golden light, and Tindra opened her eyes in Soren's arms, in his bed, in the soft amber glow of a fire someone had relit while they slept. His eyes were open. He was looking at her the way you look at something you thought you'd lost forever. It's quiet, he whispered, and the wonder in his voice broke her heart and healed it in the same breath. Tindra, it's quiet. She pressed her forehead to his and let the tears come. The silence held. Not perfectly, not all at once. Some mornings Soren woke with echoes in his ears and the taste of ash on his tongue, and Tindra would pull him closer until the last tremor passed. Some nights, the guilt returned in quieter forms, not as voices but as thoughts. He learned to speak them aloud instead of swallowing them, and she learned to listen without trying to fix what could only be carried. Healing, it turned out, was not a single act of courage on a cursed battlefield. It was 1,000 small, ordinary mornings of choosing to stay. Their mating was announced to the court on a frost-bright afternoon, a candlemaker's daughter. The whispers followed Tindra through every corridor, but she bore them with her shoulders straight and her chin level. Vela did not attend the bonding ceremony. Brielle did. She sat in the third row, and when Tindra met her eyes across the hall, her stepsister gave her a small, uncertain nod that carried more weight than any grand gesture could have. The following autumn, the Moon Festival returned. Lanterns filled the great meadow in ribbons of gold and silver. And at the center of the lantern field, where she had once stood abandoned in a borrowed gray dress, Tindra stood beside her king. His hand found hers, the way it always did, without searching, without hesitation. "Do you remember?" Soren asked quietly. "The first time I crossed this field to reach you?" Tindra looked up at him, at the steady calm in his gray eyes, at the face that had learned how to rest again. "You looked like a man about to collapse," she said. "I was." His thumb traced a slow circle against her palm. "And then I touched you, and the entire world went quiet." She leaned into his shoulder. He pressed his lips to the crown of her hair. Around them, 1,000 wolves danced and laughed and reached for each other under the silver light. And for the first time in longer than either of them could measure, the silence between them was not the absence of something terrible. It was peace.